Hello, everyone. My name is Deb Bryant. I'm the Marketing Coordinator at AVATA, and I would like to welcome you to the first webinar in our 2020 Cloud webinar series. The presentation we have prepared for today on Cloud Roadmap Analysis is very rich in content as well as strategy, and should be very helpful to those of you who are just starting out on your cloud migration journey. Joining me is AVATA's VP of Sales and Strategy, Kevin Martin, and Thomas Zarzicki, Practice Lead for Cloud ERP. We have a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. Kevin, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you for a brief introduction to AVATA.
Okay, thank you, Deb, for that introduction. On behalf of AVATA, I would like to welcome you to our first of many webinars in our series this year. As Deb mentioned, I'm Kevin Martin, Vice President of Sales. We have seen a tremendous past couple of years in growth of Oracle's cloud offerings, and we see this continuing to grow as more and more functionality migrates. AVATA is the partner to help with this migration. AVATA is a full-service consultancy firm focused on Oracle applications. We have a history and wealth of customers running Oracle in the on-premise environments. And as Oracle has migrated to the cloud offerings, we have not only followed suit with our supply chain experience, but have expanded our expertise into full ERP and EPM activities. We cover the full gamut of management consulting, implementations, customer PaaS solutions, and day two services. There are many partners to choose from. So what separates us? Our continued customer focus. Successful implementations and referrals continue to grow our customer base across the globe, from Australia to Latin America, and from the US to Europe. We have built customer PaaS solutions and integration tools that Oracle proudly shares on its marketplace. But as you will see today, it is our people, their experience and knowledge, and our focus on creating real solutions for our clients that improve and advance their ERP and supply chain needs. With that, I'd like to introduce Thomas Zarzicki, who will lead today's webinar discussion.
Excellent. Kevin, thank you for that introduction. We are extremely excited today to share some examples of cloud migration roadmaps that we had done over the years and introduce you to the process of creating a roadmap, or maybe some key elements of that. I will move on to the next slide that shows the overall process. The way we look at it is that obviously when planning your migration to Oracle Cloud, there are several important factors that you need to take into consideration. And it's not a single-threaded process. We typically would start that road mapping exercise with a high-level readiness assessment. Go through the discovery process, find out what is the strategic business context for the initiative, look at the state of the data, take into consideration risk factors, and come up with a roadmap. Typically, that assessment then informs the implementation strategy, which, again, most of the time starts with answering a question on either taking a certain chunk of operations or processes and migrating them to cloud, or starting with a specific feature. We'll address some of those considerations in a second. The next piece is sometimes you would find out that specific processes or functionalities that are likely to be migrated to cloud first are in line with Oracle's modern best practices. And as such, there will be a potential for using some of our prepackaged solutions or express integrations as part of the journey. Lastly, I think it's important to understand that with every wave or every step on the roadmap as it's being executed, the implementation itself is not the steps that completes the journey. One thing that we'll always need to take into consideration is what happens next. And so how are we going to address the cloud adoption with every wave? How are we going to manage the services that are now supported by Oracle Cloud. What we're going to do now is to take a look at the very, very first step. So everything that leads to definition of the roadmap. One thing that we typically start with is we look at the underlying migration objectives. Why are we doing it? And the slide that I'm displaying now, the purpose of it is to just list down a very common, or I should say typical, objectives that our clients that we worked with in the past, really focused on. Sometimes it's the pace of growth for a company, or the geographic expansion that essentially informs the need to move from legacy platform to Oracle Cloud. Sometimes it's the need for adoption of best industry standards. And as Oracle Cloud is built upon leading practices, adopting those in your enterprise. Most of the time, there's an overarching need for having a good visibility into your supply chain planning processes or execution itself. So, for example, ability to view all stages of order fulfillment, or ability to understand and automate all parts of the replenishment process. Sometimes there's a purely technical component of your considerations, better cost control, improving the integration between planning and execution components, or just better profitability at all assortment catalog levels. But this is just an example of what we would typically see, or maybe a set of common denominators that are driving the first step, the identification of a need to consider moving to cloud. If those objectives are not known at the very beginning, during discovery, we typically start with asking some fundamental questions about the health or the key metrics of your supply chain. The high-level questions is, for example, the alignment of the financial and operational view of your supply chain. Do you, as an organization, have a consolidated view of supply chain with full insight into customer profitability, or even the impact of physical flow of material within supply chain on your financial performance? You can also ask questions specific to processes that cross the boundaries of your system. For example, for purchasing, you can ask yourself about the level of automation of the purchasing or replenishment process. For order management, to what extent, for example, you can automate the fulfillment process for your customer orders. And then, lastly, there's always a question about the pain points in the current supply chain ERP SCM landscape. What are the handoffs between various components of your legacy infrastructure? These questions typically lead to good discoveries or good definition of the underlying principles and why we consider moving to cloud. Right now, I would like to also mention very, very quickly the importance of having a target architecture or a model view of processes as the starting point. So whether you take or you consider taking your journey to cloud in steps, in multiple steps, or in a form of a single wholesale replacement of your infrastructure today, I think it's important, especially for the multi-step migration, to have a complete view of what you want to do at the end of the journey. What is the target state? What we have right now in front of us is a view of critical components of almost every ERP SCM road mapping exercise that we have defined in the past. So a good exercise is to take a look at all modules or functionalities within the integrated supply chain in Oracle Cloud and sort of start drawing the target state by describing their purpose, their function, and how they need to talk to each other. So typically you would see as a central point inventory, item master, so a list of all SKUs or assortment that you carry as a sort of central point, with product data hub as a potential starting point for defining what you purchase, what you sell, what is flowing through supply chain. Another way to do it is to look at the customer side of things. So look at order management, how sales orders are being handled at all stages of life, from quote to finalized order through execution in inventory, manufacturing, and purchasing. Also, it is important to see the exchange of data, the interplay between the planning components, which are shown in blue boxes on the left-hand side, and the operation side. So how supply and demand planning are informing other modules. And lastly, there's the context of the financial transactions, the context of how all those events in order management and purchasing, receivables, cash management, how they turned into a set of debits and credits, so financial transactions. That's the general ledger component. And underneath, how we report on everything that is flowing in our system. So how are we going to utilize the embedded reporting platform, which is part of every cloud installation. Lastly, there's a broader context of integrating your own ERP SCM system with the outside world, whether it's e-commerce platform, third-party systems, EDI, or your financial partners, banks, and your suppliers and customers. So with that in mind, how we organize the remaining parts of our presentation is that we really wanted to give you a few examples of potential roadmaps and paths to cloud. And the way we organize them is by seeing some commonalities between various approaches that we have seen in the past. For example, you could start a journey, and we've seen roadmaps that begin the migration with just planning and financial consolidation tools. That's the orange part on the very, very top of the diagram. Sometimes, you would see a roadmap starting with very, very narrowly defined processes that are sort of isolated from the rest of activities taking place in supply chain. We call them cross-enterprise processes, marked in pink on the right-hand side. Some of the approaches that we have taken in the past were to take, let's say, procure to pay or replenishment process, or just order to cash, and under certain circumstances with some conditions, those were the best starting points for our journey. Sometimes it's even more narrowly defined set of functionalities. We call them isolated functionalities. So a very, very specific module or a feature that you want to start your journey with. Those are marked in black. Finally, there's also an element of looking at your foundational data. We already mentioned item master or product hub, and start the journey from there. With those possible paths identified, you can make an informed decision what path would best balance business benefits and the risks. Finally, when you know which elements out of the menu that we discussed just a moment ago, you can then combine them in a way that you make a very, very conscious, deliberate decision about which components you take first. For example, and the very top of the diagram, you can say, all right, let's start with core financials first. Let's allow planning and supply chain operations components feed the core financial elements of our cloud infrastructure. Let's migrate the financial reporting first. You could also, that's the second row, start with isolated functionalities first, or later on the diagram, we also have an example of a big bang approach when you say, right, look, we have a perfect functional match between functionalities that we need to have in our ERP SCM package, and it actually will be less disruptive for our organization to migrate them all in one single sweep. And we have an example of that particular decision or use case a little later in the presentation today. But whatever you do, at the end of the road mapping exercise, you would have a clear view of what your transition would be. So the inputs that we talked about, the review of leading architectures, the assessment of your organizational readiness, they would feed into a consolidated cloud financial and supply chain planning blueprint, which would be the roadmap, the set of best practices for configuration of your ERP package. And then that is shown on the right-hand side of the diagram, clearly defined set of steps or maturity points, or maybe stages of implementation that you would define. What is important here is that, the very execution of your roadmap would be of iterative character, right? So every stage, every maturity moment would then inform or update your blueprints. You want to, especially for multi-stage approach, you want to learn from every single step of that journey and make necessary adjustments. With that introduction to the overall process, what I would like to do now is to give you a few meaningful examples of high-level case studies, each showing a different variation of a roadmap or a recipe for migrating to Oracle ERP SCM Cloud. They were based on real projects, real cloud migrations or roadmaps that we defined for our clients in the past. And with every example, we would refer back to that very principal set of components that we talked about just a few moments ago. We have 7 different case studies, some of them with a hybrid approach or a multi-step migration, some of them showing or illustrating a single step or a big bang type of a journey. We would start with a mix of them. The first case would be showing how Supplier portal implementation would automate the replenishment process and communication with one of our clients' organizations. We'll then look at a complete automation of the procurement inventory management processes for a rapidly growing e-commerce company. So this is the case where that journey was taken in a single step. We have a couple of industry-specific approaches, utility company and healthcare. And we have an example where the stages for a manufacturing company were defined based on complexity of processes for all plants, all manufacturing facilities. Lastly, a typical journey that we've seen with a number of clients was where the operations side of the supply chain, the ERP component, was left to be implemented later. but the first step was to migrate the planning side to cloud. So let's take a look at our first case study. This is the case where, a very, very narrow set of cloud functionalities were implemented first. The challenge for our client was to automate the inventory replenishment process, automate the release of purchase orders, and finally, allow all suppliers to have full visibility into relevant elements of the planning process and the outputs of that process, specifically purchase order releases. So this is an example where you would start with isolated functionalities first, and then look at the cross-enterprise business processes, specifically procure-to-pay process, and only then look at the remaining parts of the ERP SCM package. So what is highlighted in this case on our diagram, you can see that from all the components or pieces of ERP SCM architecture, we have recommended implementation of planning components of Oracle Cloud. So demand planning and supply planning modules shown in blue on the left-hand side of the diagram, and then purchasing and supply portal shown in green on the left-hand side. So, the whole idea was that instead of moving the whole ERP package shown in gray boxes on the bottom of the diagram now, instead of doing that, let's look at the critical elements or the most visible pain point for our customer, which was how we generate purchase order releases based on how we generate those signals, and then two, how we communicate those purchase orders to our suppliers. And obviously, the first thing that came to mind was for the communication piece was the EDI, and the specific challenge was that the client wanted to strike a good balance between implementing EDI functionality for the largest suppliers, which was done as part of the implementation, but then allowing smaller counterparties or trading partners to utilize Supplier Portal at a much better cost profile, and shortly after the go live of Cloud ERP. So the architecture that was then devised, or the roadmap that was devised, was that we would start with a supply planning cloud component shown on the left-hand side of the diagram. We would then receive all the supply requests, so purchase order requisitions, from the planning component, automate the creation of purchase order in purchasing cloud module, that's the central part of the diagram, and communicate those purchasing documents to our suppliers through Supplier Portal and EDI. And obviously, what was critical here was to identify the exchange of data between cloud and ERP legacy platform, in this case, Oracle EBS, so sending work structures, work orders, on-hand quantities from EBS to cloud, and communicating back purchase orders and shipping confirmations from Supplier Portal back to EBS. Another case study, another possible roadmap that we wanted to share was a journey that started with looking at core financials and procure-to-pay process. So this specific company was a rapidly growing e-commerce business with a large number of nationwide warehouses and distribution centers. What they realized that, in order to keep that pace of growth, they would need a much better platform that would translate all inventory events into proper cost tracking records in financials. And they also realized that they need to completely automate the replenishment process. So this is the case where you would start with cross-enterprise processes such as inventory management, warehouse operations, and then procure to pay, see how they feed to core financials, and by looking at these two components, come up with a roadmap. And you have on the second row, on our standard set of paths, you have that journey highlighted with isolated functionalities first, then cross-enterprise look at the replenishment process or procure to pay. And one thing that over here would definitely want to add is how we came up with that very journey. I mentioned the discovery and the conversation around pain points or the legacy process as one of the first elements taken when creating roadmap to cloud. So this is an example of a sort of high-level summary of problems, pain points, boiled down to problem statements. You can see that in the second column from the left. And then, a very, very brief assessment of what we wanted to do with each individual pain point. And finally, on the right-hand side, you can see a very brief assessment of, the impact of solving those problems would have on the overall business, and also the effort that is needed to address them. And you can see that the variety or, the set of individual aspects of pain points that we identified in our journey was fairly diverse, right? There were, a lot of problems that were, very, very tactical. They were specific, but sometimes they were overarching, like number 3, the PO acknowledgement and the integration point between us and our trading partners. So after we have identified all these critical elements with our clients and have a clear understanding of how to address them, whether it's through process change, adopting model Oracle business process or configuration pattern, we then ended up with mapping them or looking at the combination of positive impact on business and the effort needed. And we started looking at, how we could possibly sort those problems in a way that by moving most impactful and the least complex elements of our puzzle to cloud first, would be able to realize that business value very early. And what happened here, in this specific example, is that we clearly saw that the automation of the purchase order creation, taking signals from inventory, from min-max planning and planning components to generate a PO, that automating that process would have the most tremendous and impactful effect on our client organization. We ended up then with a very tight definition of what needs to happen in order to reach that level of automation. We have identified a number of very, very specific integration points between Oracle backend systems and outside parties. We identified what needs to happen in order to automate the configuration process, the expansion, and we ended up with a very, very clear selection of the components that we saw in our earlier part of the presentation today. We ended up implementing receivables, purchasing, cash management, payables, and integrating them tightly with e-commerce platform and EDIs. And as a result, because we had those business objectives and metrics defined at the very, very earliest stage, at the end of the journey where the procurement process was implemented, within 2-3 weeks after go live, we were able to drastically reduce the number of steps needed to communicate purchase orders to our clients. We reduced the time needed for all buyers to review the replenishment signals and turn them into POs. And we allowed the company to grow at the desired pace, where they expect the number of locations that they handle on Oracle Cloud Platform in 2020, they expected that number to double or triple within 12 months after go live. The next example is an industry-specific one. It's the case where, rather than looking at typical supply chain processes that almost every single company or organization handling a supply chain would have, instead of that, you're looking at a very, very specific industry vertical that has its own very, very distinct challenges or characteristics. And we have two industry-specific case studies here, or two roadmaps. We'll start with a utility company, where obviously everything about this type of business is the network, is the set of assets and how they operate, and how all operational growth aspects related to that network, how procuring services, supplies needed to operate that network for a utility company. It was important for us to look at that very process, asset management, and answer a question on how cloud could help. So this is the case where you're looking at very, very isolated functionality first, and then trying to identify cross-functional business processes for it. So on this diagram then, we have essentially mapped the actual physical representation of both current as well as planned infrastructure operated by this utility company, and map all asset components onto the actual physical flow, the actual process between supply, transmission operations to demand and order fulfillment. And what we were able to see is how operating and growing that asset network, what challenges that represents to supply chain planning and operations. And this is the very, very, very high level set of challenges: asset structure, the interplay between demand supply planning, and then consolidated physical and financial view of the network. The three main challenges that were very, very clear or prominent for our customer. We then mapped, that's the second column, that's the column in the middle, the response. We then identified possible responses, tactical responses to those challenges, and also identified the very, very specific functionalities or modules that were provided by Oracle in the current release. And we therefore were able to make a very, very informed decision about what to implement first. Another industry-specific example of a roadmap is cloud migration roadmap for healthcare, where, as you may imagine, the key challenge here is to somehow balance the need for optimizing the inventory that you are holding at all sort of levels of your supply network with, a very, very clear demand for instant availability of all medical supplies when they are needed at a medical facility, hospital, or clinic. It all obviously started with the mapping of material flow between distribution centers, suppliers, and then hospitals, clinics, and PAR locations or storerooms at each and every facility. And, with that physical view in mind, or having realized or mapped the physical structure of inventory management processes for our clients, we identified one specific need, which was to look at PAR locations replenishment and maybe take one step forward with slightly better replenishment mechanism than your traditional techniques or methods for PAR replenishment or min-max methods. And we ended up with a set of features between inventory management, supply order orchestration, and procurement that allows our clients to gradually move from traditional PAR locations replenishment method or min-max planning, somewhat, maybe less precise than needed, towards a model where we would take, a variety of signals or input sources, for example, shipments to PAR locations, and combination of those with the data from other clinic systems, so the data on operations procedures performed. And we were able to optimize those replenishment signals in a balanced and gradual manner towards a state where we were able to realize some very, very clear efficiencies. And to put all that road mapping exercise in the content, right now it's important to reiterate that both architecture and the steps towards the target technical architecture are great, but they not placed in a complete vacuum. They're always in the context of a specific set of challenges and expected results. Obviously, we were talking so far about the examples of a multi-step transition, but what I wanted to mention is that, sometimes the result of the road mapping exercise is that we would realize that, a specific case is, I don't want to say simple enough, but at least we can see a very, very clear set of functionalities in cloud that would be beneficial in almost every area of SCM ERP operations. And as such, we would see a case where it makes sense, rather than taking multiple steps, take that big bang approach and move the whole ERP SCM package to cloud in one single sweep. This is the case where we had a perfect functional match, and all functionalities of legacy JDE platform that we're about to retire had a clear, perfect equivalent of cloud. And this is the case where the recommendation was to move all cloud ERP SCM components, so from planning central, supply demand planning, through order orchestration, manufacturing, inventory management and warehouse operations, and core financials, all those components, to move them in one single move. And once again, the integration context is important. If you're moving, just in this case, if you're moving the whole JDE legacy platform to cloud, it's important to see it in the context of all your trading partners, customers, and the information channels that you communicate with. And in this case, one thing that I would like to highlight is having an integration package or predefined set of connection points between ERP SCM and the outside world is important. And this is an example of just communicating all possible stages of order fulfillment with the outside world. Sometimes the question on how to stage your journey, how to create a roadmap, is less about which functionalities go first, which go later. Sometimes it's about, the organizational approach and maybe looking at complexity of all manufacturing plants or inventory organizations that you operate. And in this case, this is the roadmap where, we didn't necessarily decide which process goes into cloud first, which goes later, but the question is which manufacturing plants would need to be migrated, in what order, what groups. So typically what you do when you have multiple inventory organizations and or manufacturing organization or plants, you look at complexities of what they actually produce, manufacture. There's a set of standard questions that we have available as part of our road mapping toolkit. This is just a high-level selection of them seen in the second column from the left. So obviously what you see here is the process or summary of that discovery, where assessing the complexity of each manufacturing organization, inventory organization, and or plant group will then lead to various possible ways of organizing or grouping that migration. And in this case, it's not by functionality, it's by plant or plant group. And obviously, we can then look at a conservative rollout where we start with low volume, low risk parts of the organization, or maybe look at more of an accelerated path where we start in the pilot phase with low business complexity and low volume and go straight to high volume. And then, we already talked about a little bit about the iterative process of that journey. In this case, after having defined the roadmap, we also defined very, very clear progression criteria between each individual manufacturing plant and part of the organization, and how the feedback from each of the rollout waves would then form next steps. The last, or an example of a roadmap that we wanted to share with you today, is the case where it's sort of rather obvious choice for many of our clients, where instead of looking at or trying to migrate the operations side of the house, so ERP component of your technology landscape, instead of doing that, you're looking only at supply chain planning components, so supply, demand, sales and operations planning, features, and you move them to cloud first, leaving the actual operations on the legacy platform. Only then moving the operations side or core ERP. Final thoughts to summarize the road mapping importance and the few examples that we share with you today. It's always important to identify the strategic context of your journey and know what your key business objectives are. Even if you're planning for multi-step, multi-year migration, it's important to have that target architecture and target view of process in view. And finally, from experience, the road mapping itself, in our view, is always that delicate balance between the desired business outcome and operational risk and your ability to change. With that, I'll hand over the presentation to Deb. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to continue our conversation, discuss some of the detailed case studies later this year.
Thank you, Thomas. That was a lot of information to absorb. And if you're still wondering where to start, we do offer a free cloud readiness consultation.
You can let us know of your interest by clicking on the Connect box in the follow-up email.
As mentioned earlier, this is the first in our 2020 Cloud Webinar Series. Other webinars that you can look for this year will be on topics such as power management for healthcare, integrating S&OP with financials, ERP SCM Cloud accelerators, and Demand Management Cloud. Dates for these webinars will be on our website and also in our email news updates. And in case you didn't know, Oracle's Modern Business Experience is coming up soon in Chicago. AVATA is thrilled to be a platinum sponsor this year. We will have several customers that will be presenting their cloud stories, and we have a lot of other fun things planned as well. So stop by our booth and say hi if you're in Chicago. Thomas and Kevin will both be at the conference. You can stop by and have a chat with either of them or schedule a meeting for a more in-depth conversation. There are several ways to contact us, and we would love to hear from you. We do appreciate you taking the time to view this webinar today, and we encourage you to complete the survey to let us know how we can help you in your cloud journey. Thank you, and have a great day.